Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. This is our last episode of Back to School series by Runecast. I'm really, really happy that we're doing this today because it's on a very important topic. My name is Markov, and I am the CEO and one of the co-founders of Runecast, and also a VCDX number 74. And I'm super thrilled to be joined by VCDX number 1, John Arrasjid. Thank you so much for your time and for joining us today. When we were talking about this session, I learned some things also about the history of VCDX, and I think that we will cover very interesting topics today. So thank you again for joining us.
Yep, happy to be here.
Yeah, and well, the first thing that we're going to start with really is what is VCDX. I know that you've talked about this topic for many, many years, and you're really the right person to actually introduce this to the audience, whoever is not fully familiar with the certification.
Yep, sure, absolutely. One of the things I do want to call out is I'm going to show a couple of slides and we'll talk around those, but it's not the full set of slides that are part of the VCDX workshop. Phil Monk and Chris Muchler have been owning the deck. I'm including a couple of the slides that give you the overview, but I do want to reference people to those workshops as a great way to get up to speed and learn a little bit more about the details on that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a share. I'm not going to go into presenter mode. I'm just going to have the slides up just because it'll be a little bit easier to save on time. Let me go ahead and wait a minute. Oh, I guess you have to allow me to share, or if you want to bring up the deck, either way.
Yeah, I will do it right now, or I'll probably allow you to share. I'll make you a co-host.
Okay.
So that should be sufficient. Maybe you can try now.
Yep. So let's see here. Are you seeing that slide? Is that working?
Yes.
There we go. Cool. So this is just the cover slide. There's nothing to talk about here other than I want to call out that Phil and Chris have been owning the updated workshop deck. And what they do is they use this deck for these workshops that are carried on around the world. I'm not sure all the different regions we have, but I think we have a pretty good geographic representation on the call right now. I'm only going to go through a couple of these slides from the big deck just to kind of give you the background. First off, why get the VCDX certification? The key thing here is there have been a number of architect level certifications from Cisco, from Microsoft. There are also other types of architecture methodologies like TOGAF and Zachman. And what we did when we started developing the VCDX program, it actually got started around about 2006 timeframe, and took us about 3 years to get to the point where we could actually do internal testing. So around about 2007, we started doing internal testing so that we could validate what we were checking on, what we were evaluating an individual for, so that they can be successful. A couple of key things on this that I want to call out is when we test for a VCDX, we're not testing for the maximum qualifications. We're searching for somebody who has the minimum or higher qualifications to be able to take on an architecture design project. So if Stan or myself were working on a project and we have a new member join that has VCDX background, even if they just got the certification, our expectation is they can be successful to continue the work on that design with a little bit of input. Obviously, that's going to be needed, but we can trust that they can actually take that information and take it to the next step. Finish off the design, identify the specialists they might need for certain areas. All of us have different areas that we may have deep dive on. We may all have general coverage, but the key is looking at some of the qualifications. And the way that we look at the different certifications is a stepwise process. I'm going to run through that real quick. So in the road to the VCDX, there is a handbook and a blueprint guide that covers all of the details. What are the things that you need to have in preparation for this? But this slide calls out the estimated timeframes that it'll take to go through this entire process. For my design, I actually ended up having 7 panelists because at the point that I did it, we did not have the full structure in place. So we actually had more people doing the evaluation for the first few of us. And then in 2008 is when we actually finally came with the final versions of everything. We did have those of us who participated early, I guess we'll call ourselves grandfathers, but I'm not going to say it was easier. It was actually more challenging because at the time we started, we looked for maximally qualified versus minimally qualified. And we learned through the different certification companies, what are the qualifications that you want to look for and why you're not looking for the maximally qualified, why you want to have somebody who will, will have a starting point and then continue to learn as they go forward. Just like Stan and myself, we got our VCDXs, and even since then, we're constantly learning new things, kind of like what we have on some of the things we've described in the past, like the new AI types of infrastructure support. And we may touch on that a little bit later on as part of the chat. Another thing that I think a lot of people ask about is what demonstrates design expertise. I've called out the bullet items here. I won't specifically read each item. I'll let you guys read that. But the one thing I want to call out is that you need to know what the design qualifications are, what are the business drivers from the customer, what are the requirements, what are the constraints that may or may not be changeable. Sometimes the constraints are kind of fixed. There might be a budget constraint that's not easily changeable. There might be a technology choice that has to stay in the design that might require working around that for integration. But the key thing that you want to do is as you go through this design and you actually have others that are helping you in putting together the design, you need to understand all of the elements. You need to understand why certain decisions were made. You do not have to be an expert, but if you don't know the answer to a question from a panelist when you're going through the design, that doesn't mean that you're going to fail the exam. What it does mean is they need more information, or they want clarification, or they want to see how much are you aware of the design and the implications of that design, both positive and negative. Now, as we go forward, there are a number of different design area considerations. There's a functional aspect where we look at the requirements, the constraints. There may be assumptions. I recommend you validate those assumptions because those are some high-risk areas. But you also need to look at risk management. In the design, there are going to be some design points that may pose specific risks. For example, if you decide to mix your vMotion network with production workloads, there may be a specific business justification why you have to do that. Maybe you have a very small environment, you have a very strict set of budgets and technologies to support that. But these are things you have to factor in. And then you also have to identify what is not in scope. On the technical side, there's the conceptual, logical, and physical design areas as you go from the customer's initial idea in the conceptual design or conceptual model to the logical design where you call out the elements without specifying configuration details, settings, or specific products. The idea is to have a further discussion so that you can then nail down the specific elements in the physical design and the specific configurations. The other thing that is important to include is the design considerations you had, the justifications, as well as the impact. There is something that I worked on a few years ago where we actually had a table, and we did a workshop years ago. I'm hoping we'll eventually get this reintroduced. It was called the VCDX Fast Track. But in there, we created a number of different workbooks where people would fill in design considerations, the impact on the design, why it was done, but also the other reasons why this may have some risk that needs to be addressed. Those are things like, do you have a 25G network or a 100G network? Well, if you're doing a lot of AI or a lot of data transfer, you probably want to pick the faster performance side. Now, what are some of the characteristics of an individual? They want to show mastery in these 4 key areas. There are other areas that are important. These are kind of the high level, but looking at implementation, looking at the risk, how do you identify what are the challenges that you may have to address now or later, and how do you mitigate that risk? looking at having an organized and clear technical communication. I have reviewed designs from individuals across the world. And as part of that, not everyone, and I would say a majority of the designs that I've had to look at, English was not the first language for the individual who did that. That does not mean that you have a disadvantage. All it means is be a little bit thorough in looking through your design. You can explain the different areas. We do understand that not all translation tools are perfect. And, as we go through and you do a design submission, thinking about how you cover those areas is going to be important, but also how you actually respond to some of the questions that are coming into place. And then the very last slide I wanted to cover is something that Stan and I were talking about in preparation for this call. What are the things that we use for design principles on both infrastructure design, but also software design? And we have this acronym we call AMPRS, which stands for availability, manageability, performance, recoverability, and security. And there's also the risk management as well. But these are the things that we use as the high level, I guess I'll say, categories of things that we want to cover within the design. And if you have that, you basically have what you need. Now, there's another slide they included in here, but I didn't want to bring it up because it looked too much like a marketing. I'll just speak to it. There are a couple of books that Mark Gabrielski, another VCDX, myself, Chris McCain, and we've had others that have participated in that, have created a series of books called the IT Architect series. And the first book in it is The Foundation in Infrastructure Design, which is based on a vSphere 5 environment. Why do we have an older design? We did this when vSphere 6 was out. We did that specifically because there's a body of evidence out there, documentation, white papers, knowledge base articles, and so on, that can be used to help people in learning design. So that book is to teach the methodology. We call out the references to Zachman and Togaf and others as well. But the goal is to teach people what are the key things that we found in the VCDX world that helps drive success with our customers and our designs that we work on. And there are a couple of other books that we also have in the series, one by Melissa Palmer, one by Damon Baer, and then we have another collection. There's 2 volumes out so far, Stories from the Field, that talk about all the different types of, I'll call them horror stories. We didn't use that in the title, but some of them are horror stories. I'll give one example. A design for a particular data center in one region. The customer decided that they were going to move into an older data center building. It wasn't a data center building, but it became a data center building. The first floor was where they put their equipment. The second floor, there actually happened to be a recreation area, a gym. There was a swimming pool, and they had a pretty bad disaster where the power went out. There was a generator that did not start up after the batteries ran out. And because of that, the heating couldn't run. The pipes froze in the building, and clean water and gray water, I'll just leave it at that. And what happened is when they came in, they powered things up. They ended up having what's called a hazmat situation. There was a health risk for people to deal with that. And that was a mess. So we cover those stories and what could be done. In some cases, there's nothing that can be done after the fact other than to try to do recovery. But before the fact, they could have done more validation of the environment and what the risk was, and actually do that trade-off, and actually maybe even talk to their insurance company about this to see, hey, what are the things that we need to do so we get full coverage? But with that, I'll stop on that. I think I covered a lot on there, but I do recommend the VCDX workshop for those that are pursuing it. And I'm more than happy to answer questions that people have if you want to reach out to me. I'm on Twitter for now. I'm looking at Blue Sky. We'll see how the new X goes as we go forward. So
yeah. Thanks very much, John. I think this is super interesting, and to me also it's very important, this horror example that you gave, because it's a consideration that you have to take into the physical world as well, right? Because we're thinking, okay, we're designing here a virtual infrastructure, okay, but it's all, on planet Earth, it's all kind of running physical elements. So you have to consider even things like that, even natural disasters or, particularities of the building. So I really like how even in preparation to VCDX and learning the methodology more, it really helps you to have a more broader thinking, really to try to consider everything that could go wrong, pretty much, and
And
also, yeah,
sorry,
yeah,
well, there's one thing I wanted to just jump in on also. There are a number of people who went through the process, did not complete it, but they learned a lot about it, which helped them in their career. We also have individuals who may have had to take 2 or 3 passes on it, attempts on it, but once they completed it, they saw the value. It opens a lot of different doors for those
yeah,
who are aware of the program. A lot of times it's actually helped me, and I'm sure, Stan, in your case, the same thing. When you want to talk with executives, it gives a little extra validation on your background, that it's not just the technical piece, but it's also the strategic thinking and overall planning related to the business.
yeah, absolutely. And actually, for me, VCDX was very valuable. It gave a lot of credibility. In fact, the time when I got my VCDX, I was the first and only one in the whole IBM globally to have VCDX. And I remember when I got it, it was sometime in February, just a few weeks later in March. There was a customer, probably the biggest bank in Egypt, that they requested from IBM VCDX to work on their architecture. And
Yeah.
I was the only one in the entire company of 400,000 people that had that. So a few days later, I was flying to Cairo, and I was sitting in a room with all the stakeholders, basically. So it was really interesting experience. And at that time, you still have kind of a little bit of imposter syndrome, and it's probably you got the accreditation, but still, you probably don't feel at that level yet.
Yeah.
So yeah, it was an interesting journey.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure if you touched on it, but maybe for some of the people on the call, just you might all be aware how to actually get to VCDX, to VMware Certified Design Expert certification. But what I think probably you covered it on the first slide, but I believe the process still involves first passing the VCP, right? And then
Yes.
the 2 VCIX certifications.
Exactly. Those are the 2 prerequisites. So there is the VCP. There are 4 tracks right now. And so that's what individuals have to check and determine what they want to work on. The infrastructure design, the end user computing related design, the networking design, and then also tied to cloud as well. Now, there may be other ones that will come down the road. But it's going to be based on a number of different factors. I think right now we're probably set on these 4 for the foreseeable future. We'll see how things go as things evolve at VMware under Broadcom, if everything actually completes on that acquisition. But I do know there's a huge backing, not just within VMware, as people are aware, but also across the industry. And we're expecting that that's going to continue. We may see other things that come out of this as well. But the key thing is, what we tried to do with VCDX was to try to look at all the other architecture and design level classes, certifications, methodologies, to try to come up with something that can apply whether or not you use VMware. These methodologies can be applied for other vendor solutions, for cloud, and so on. I think the one area that may evolve is related to what we're trying to do these days with generative AI. And large language models. And I think that's going to have some further evolution. Maybe we'll have a certification in that area, or it may be a branch off of one of the existing VCDX areas as well.
Yeah, it makes sense. And just to give an example of the methodology that it's so universal that can be used at so many places, we definitely used it in Runecast as well as we were developing the solution. Probably everybody on the call is aware since we're organizing this webinar, but Runecast Analyzer is software which crawls tens of thousands, if not millions, of articles out there, vulnerabilities, knowledge base articles, security guidelines, translating those into machine-readable rules, and then using those rules with our patented rules engine to discover misconfigurations, vulnerabilities, best practice violations in your VMware environment or cloud, Kubernetes, Windows, Linux environment. And for those of you that use Runecast or will use, you will see a lot of the elements and terminology coming from VCDX actually. So the thing that you mentioned, John, about AMPRS, availability, manageability, performance, recoverability, security. So the design qualities. We have categorized all of these thousands of rules that we have in one of those categories. And also they're categorized on infrastructure layer. So compute, network, storage, VM management, because all of that really helps you see all of these different angles of where you want to focus your attention. Maybe security of your compute is important. Yeah. So it really maps out nicely to the categories and design qualities that are in VCDX. And I think it goes back to what you were saying about having a common language between everybody involved in designing, deploying, and managing the infrastructure, which is, I think, really important. I think a lot of the world's problems are actually coming from miscommunication. So I'm all for really having a common language that is, I would say, fairly simple, simple enough, as you said. When you designed the VCDX program and the methodology, you looked at many different certifications and methodologies. And I was familiar with the IBM method, or as we call it, the method. But it's, I don't know, 100 times more complicated. There's all kinds of corner cases that are described there, which I don't think in practice are necessary for most of the projects. So I really fell in love with VCDX when I saw it, because it really distilled the most important things that are useful for you as an architect and as someone that's not only designing but managing the infrastructure.
One thing that's also interesting for people to consider is when you complete a design, you're not done. I mean, there's still the obvious point of presenting it to the customer or your line of business, the people that are going to be using this, to walk through it. And it's important for an individual to be clear in how they cover this. And so one of the things that some people have recommended to others is Toastmasters or other types of speaking types of opportunities. The one thing that I found useful through my training on speaking at VMworld and VMware Explore was always record yourself presenting so that you can actually see some of the things that you might do that you might want to change. I used to a lot of times say, there's all these different things that we do.
All the pillars.
If you pause for just a second, it may feel like it's minutes to you, but nobody even notices that you're thinking about it. And if you ever watch keynote speakers, Pat Gelsinger did this, Paul Moritz has done this, Raghu has done this, as leadership from my side, where you can tell when they're thinking before they speak. I mean, everyone has prompters and so on, for the keynotes and stuff. But when you do your VCDX defense, you're not going to have a keynote prompting display. So you want to go through this exercise. And if you can do what's called a mock defense, where you get others to actually review, do the presentation, have them do some critique, I think that's a great opportunity. And every single individual that I've talked to who've gone through that process has learned a lot. And I think it's actually helped them in their day-to-day activities as well as they learn some of these new skills.
Yeah, like my mom says, better to shed some blood before the battle than during the battle. So,
exactly. Yeah.
I've done that a lot with VCDX, and also before VCDX. Actually, that was my logical way or thinking how to become better in presenting, is to become a certified instructor. So I became a VCI, a VMware certified instructor beforehand, and I was teaching some courses before I got to a point where I thought, okay, I think I'm ready for VCDX for the defense. And I put some whiteboards also at home and really started to use them more often. So I think this really helped, but I'm really glad actually that you mentioned Toastmasters. That's something I discovered after VCDX. And I've been doing it for a few years, not anymore, but it's really interesting. And it's a global organization. I'm sure in your city, those that are listening, they're probably, if you just Google Toastmasters Club, they're probably one or more. And it's really a way how to improve your public speaking, presentation skills. You get really useful feedback. So yeah, I didn't know that you're going to mention that, but I'm a big fan of Toastmasters, and I recommend to everyone to actually give it a try.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and,
So
and yeah, go ahead.
there's one thing I wanted to jump back on the approach that Runecast is taking on using large language models. We're doing something similar, and I see a lot of other companies are doing this, where you do what's called domain specific large language
Yes.
models. Now, you can take general large language models and use that to refine and retrain based on domain specific. And that's one of the things that we're trying to do at VMware. And I see other companies and open source groups are trying to do the same thing. Can you start with a curated large language model that takes a long time to develop? It's a high cost, but is cleaned of information that could be biased. And the hard part on this is if you have a medical condition and you wanted to use a generative AI or a large language model solution to get answers on how to do treatment. Let's
Mm.
pick diabetics as an example. Let's say that somebody has an insulin pump and they have a continuous tester for the diabetes that may not be available everywhere, but let's just use that as an example. If I run into an issue with the pump or the tester, do I want to ask or do a query of a large language model that uses every piece of information on the internet or the ones that they search, like Facebook, Twitter, etc.? Or do you want to use one that uses medical reference material,
Mm.
things that the doctors use, things that pharmacists might use to actually look at the health background, to determine what is the best recommendation? And so, for example, in a situation for a diabetic, or if you have cancer, or you have certain other very challenging, I'll call them situations, you want to make sure you're getting the right information. And that's why we
Mm.
see also healthcare industry, the financial industry, even in manufacturing and so on. People are looking at using that domain specific information so that they have the best accurate information and you don't get what they call hallucinations. Those are, there's
Yes.
no answer. And so just like a human might make a guess, the
Yeah.
large language model makes that guess, and obviously it might be false, and so you don't want to
Mm.
risk your life or
Yeah.
financial or other things on that. So I definitely want to commend you guys for doing that, because I think that's going to be great, taking advantage of the knowledge base articles and other information that you have related to that. There's one area too that we talked about yesterday in prep for the call that I thought would be very valuable. The area that I cover in my current role is in the financial industry, and there's a lot of things that we've been looking at that the customer asks us, "Hey, can you help us in an audit? We're going through this regulatory compliance." In the past, it's been like GDPR, PCI, HIPAA. Now we've got the new European regulation around DORA. And I think that's another one that my customers are bringing up with me, because they need to make sure that they follow this, because unlike GDPR, which had guidelines, it was more general. This is more specific with DORA, and they have very strict penalties if you don't follow that. And I know that you guys are working in this space, and I thought it might be a good opportunity to share with people this, because regulatory compliance or governance is critical in the VCDX approach. And when you do your defense, I can pretty much guarantee that that will be touched on at some point. But I brought it up because I know that, and I've known you guys for a number of years doing this, working with regulatory compliance, including some of these new areas that are emerging, but they're also more stringent than the prior guidelines. And I didn't know if you wanted
Yeah.
to touch base on that, because I think it's
Yeah,
very.
absolutely. I think it's important. It's very relevant actually to the whole design process because, as you said, regulatory compliance has become more and more important when it comes to constraints and requirements for your design. Especially in the last few years, there's more and more of these regulatory standards. They're more and more enforced, and they're bigger and bigger penalties. I mean, I think everyone's familiar with GDPR, DORA, or Digital Operational Resiliency Act. That's what it stands for, DORA. It is like the GDPR for BFSI or financial services organizations that have any business in European Union, which is any European one or global ones that have some offices there. So I'm comparing it to GDPR because it's a regulation. If it's a regulation, this means it's a law once it's enforced, and that will be in January 2025. It's already in place, but it will be enforceable in January 2025. So not only banking, finance, insurance, investment companies have to comply, but also service providers that are servicing these industries. So it's really wide scope of organizations that are under DORA. Yeah, as mentioned, it's really relevant also for design thinking, because suddenly lawyers become one of the stakeholders when you're doing your design, and also taking into account such regulations. So because it will be illegal to be in compliance after January 2025. So that's a very, very serious thing that everybody has to start preparing now. And yeah, at Runecast, definitely we actually already introduced compliance scanning against DORA for VMware, and later this week we'll be introducing also DORA compliance scanning for your Windows and Linux systems. And what this will do, it will continuously check your security configuration settings, and it will tell you whether you are compliant or not against all the or the specific DORA articles. And the reason why using our proprietary natural language processing, natural language understanding modules that we've been developing over years, in combination of some of the newest LLMs out there, like Claude 2 by Anthropic, plus our expertise that we built out in the team over the years, is that just as GDPR, since this is an initial release of DORA, it's written by lawyers, pretty much, or regulators, which are not always the most technical people. You know, when time goes by, these articles that are have more legal language will be translated more into technical requirements, but everyone has to start preparing already. So what AI helped us with, together with our expertise, is really to map out these all of these articles into specific technical checks and controls. So within Runecast now, within the interface, and everybody can check it at demo.runecast.com, we have the product running there, is you can directly see which parts of your environment, which specific setting is in compliance, and to which article from DORA, along with other regulatory standards. So in case you have an audit, of course, you can always either give them access or export a report and show where you are compliant, hopefully everywhere, when it comes to DORA. So yeah, certainly we have been, living and breathing AI, natural language processing, natural language understanding since the very inception of Runecast, and the latest advancements in LLMs are definitely helping accelerate that as well. So I completely agree that you have to be very careful with the data you're feeding any language model with, and it has to be very specific, very clean, and I think that's a good example, and the example you gave with healthcare is even more critical, right? It's really, you really don't want to make a mistake there. So yeah, thanks for bringing it up.
Now, there's another thing too that's related to this that I thought would be interesting. We touched base on this a little bit. It's something that I did a talk on at VMware Explore in Las Vegas. I won't be joining in Barcelona, so I'll say hi in advance from here, but maybe next year I'll join again. But basically, I did one thing with Chris Gully. I'm not sure if people here know him, but he has worked at Dell, similar to myself. He's working at VMware. And he has been doing some focus on a couple of different areas around AI as well. So we've done a couple of talks on there. I definitely encourage you, if you're interested, that are those that are on the call. Two of them are on AI, both from how do we support AI workloads and how are we using AI, similar to what Runecast is doing. We're doing something similar on using large language models tied to our knowledge base articles, our white papers, and typical things that come up, so that we can actually have a faster process to go through tier 1, 2, and 3 as needed to get a quicker response for individuals. Now, there's another talk that I did that I think is also something that people may be interested in, although it may be a few years before it becomes even more commonplace. But just like AI, things are moving fast, and that is in the quantum computing space. Tony Foster, known as Wonder Nerd online, I think several of you know him. He and I gave a talk through the Tech Talks on what is the current state of quantum computing. One of the things, I won't go into all the details, it's something you guys can get online, but I wanted to kind of call out that this is something that may come into play. And just like I'm learning in the financial space with AI and the high cost of GPUs, tensor processing units, and other types of accelerators, a lot of things are being pushed to the edge or to the cloud because of the cost. So core would be traditional CPU in the main data center, potentially, or in the cloud. But when you get to dealing with a lot of GPUs, it becomes very cost prohibitive for an enterprise customer to actually buy all this equipment and have it and justify it. So what we're seeing is a lot of cloud providers are adding GPUs and tensor processing units. This has been going on for years now in the cloud. So that gets pushed there. Quantum computing definitely will be something that will be reserved for the really top tier companies like IBM, Amazon, maybe Microsoft. They're all doing work in this space. The rest of us, I don't think we're going to be building or using quantum computers in our data center. What we would do is, if we need that, especially for working with AI, and people are aware of neural networks, think about quantum computing as something a little bit different. It can actually be used for AI, but it's based on probabilities versus specific formulas. And I'm going to claim that I'm not the expert in this area, but I do know enough to kind of talk the talk. What I see here is that's where people would actually be using most of those types of workloads out at the edge. It's something for consideration. I don't think most people are touching this right now, but I think it's a good time. If you just look at how fast Gen AI with ChatGPT has gone from last year to where it is today, that is a massive, massive acceleration, not just because of the hardware, but because of some of the algorithms and slightly different approaches that are taken. So anyways, food for thought for those who are looking at the future. That's something I would look at also.
And it's really, tying this back to, in general, design thinking and VCDX. There is, you said that, for example, one of your books is about vSphere 5 and intentionally for this. And we're now talking about AI, quantum computing. Do you believe that this design thinking is still relevant, and in what way when?
The design thinking is still relevant, but the one thing from what we covered, the examples, we didn't cover cloud, which would also be applied to this type of consideration on AI. Most of the customers that I'm working with are utilizing GPUs in-house, but the cost is significant for getting a large number of them. And now that there's sharing of GPUs through virtualization, and there's a few additional approaches that need to be taken for GPUs versus traditional CPUs. But given the progress in that area, I see this as as something that traditional design methodologies can still apply, but there are specific areas that will be focused on supporting the AI workloads, especially when you're working with the large language models, because you're dealing with super large data lakes, and you're also dealing with a lot of data transfer. So figuring out the right location to do the processing is going to be critical. Anything that can be done at the edge, would be great. But in many cases, it still has to be done in a particular high compute environment, whether it's in a data center or in a cloud platform.
Yeah. And you still have to consider all of the design qualities, right? So availability, security, manageability, performance, cost, of course. Yeah, it's what I actually like, and I use at least parts of the design thinking or the VCDX processes when I have to make certain decisions or designing even pricing or anything else that I need to present to someone. I always try to present my way of thinking. So the best way is really to do it in a similar way how we're doing it with VCDX, is presenting the architectural decision, the alternatives, and why you chose certain alternative. Because then once you have it documented, others can see your thinking and maybe can help you adjust some of the things. Maybe some of the assumptions you've had are incorrect. Maybe they have additional information. Plus, also in future, if you have to go back to why something was designed in a certain way, you can see the exact way of thinking, the assumptions, and so it's really
The
useful.
traceability around there is very important. I'll give you one other example of where something could go wrong if you, as an individual doing design, do not document the process, what was given, and so on. And here's an example, and this is going back well over 10 years. I had been asked to do a review of a design that a customer had done when I was doing professional services at VMware, and the design was not complete. I'd say it was 3/4 complete. The customer knew that, I knew that. So I did the review of what I could. And I said, look, I can't comment on these areas because it's either not done or it refers to a section that has not been done. So before you continue with an implementation, when you have these areas filled out, bring it back to us so we can review it. And I had this all threaded out in, all kept track of. I wanted to make sure the customer was aware that I was given the most information to help them move forward and finish the design. What they did, though, is they finished the design, had no review with myself or anyone else from my team. They did an implementation, and then it was roughly 7 or 8 months after I had done that review and gave them the feedback that they did an implementation and they had a problem and they had an outage. And so I was asked, say, hey, you did the review. There was a design issue. They had a failure. I go, well, let's go take a look at the history. We came up with the notes. We had the confirmation that the customer was going to share the design back so we could give the final review before they went into implementation. But they went ahead anyways. It's important to do that, cover your tracks, or you can use the CYA acronym or whatever, but it's important you document it not only for you, the individual who's doing the design, but for your team and for the customer to make sure that there's checks and balances. Another example is in a design, if you see that there is a constraint that you're given that does not make sense, but you cannot get the customer to make a change on that, document it in your design. Call it out. Some people like to use red text or red boxes, but whatever your favorite color is to flag that. It's important because it is traceability to why certain recommendations are given and why, if you do something that goes against best practices, what do you need to watch for before it becomes a disaster? And in a situation, for example, where you're overloading a vMotion network, at some point that will be a challenge. How do you fix that? Make sure that you document things. You may not be able to fix the problem in advance, but you want to make sure the customer is aware of that risk. So
yeah, and maybe a bit different, but in the same line of thought. I always felt as an architect that you are almost a mediator. You must be sometimes almost a politician to get everybody on the same page. Of course, you have to have a strong voice, but some of the important stakeholders, especially on the customer side, you need to rally them around what is best for them, essentially, and really meeting the requirements. I learned this lesson, especially I was doing a design for a big hospital in Abu Dhabi, in fact, and everything was going great. I think at some point, though, when the design was almost ready, I believe I was checking often enough with one of the main stakeholders on the customer side. But at some point when I presented the almost finished design, he was saying, well, we didn't agree on that. We didn't agree on that. He didn't check. I think, there were certain political reasons he was doing that for, but I realized that I could have checked even more often with him and involve him in the process so that there is no way he would say in the end, well, that's not what we agreed on. So,
but by the way, that also is, there's another related story, and that is be aware of if you, like Stan and myself have done, you travel around the world and you're working with people from different cultures, different backgrounds, be aware of that when you actually are presenting things. So here's an example, and this is kind of a maybe a little silly one. Red text in some cultures means something really bad, that you failed and all that, and somebody might get punished, in some way, it's a negative. So be aware of that and adapt to the environment and the culture that you're working with, so that you use the right terms. Be aware that sometimes you might say something humorous in your design, just as kind of a commentary thing. Be aware that doesn't always come across that way. So just make sure that you're adapting to that, and you have other people who are reviewing your design before you actually present it.
Yeah, and this leads me to actually one, I think, challenge that a lot of people that transition into becoming architects, like I think a lot of us, I'm from a sysadmin background, basically, and then
Yeah.
I became an architect after, which I think comes with change of thinking a little bit. Can you say something to that? And in what way should your thinking change, let's say, to
Yeah, so I did sysadmin for years before I joined VMware. When I came onto VMware, I joined as a consultant, and what I did learn going from an admin to an architect. In an admin, we do need to know all the details of the specific technologies that we have, but a lot of times we're focused on one technology at a time. In some cases, there are related technologies that you have to look at both areas, but when we get to an architect level, the design for an infrastructure is going to be way beyond what we would do as an individual admin. So in my prior roles, I've done things related to Linux and Windows support, admin around the different applications and so on. I got into data center design in the traditional way that we had before virtualization and before we had cloud. But in each step of the way, I've had times where I've said, well, why was it designed this way? Because I'm seeing something that doesn't make sense. So that's where I'm finding it makes sense to understand more of the design aspects, even if you're only doing the admin and you don't even have a goal of becoming an architect. You should still understand the architect principles. And to make that transition is going from knowing all the deep dive details of configurations to looking at how pieces of technologies work together, how the users and the applications integrate or implement or utilize those tools and those technologies to get their business outcomes. And in the past, when I've run IT groups, I've done that at a couple of different companies. Um, it was always focused on line items, kind of like a ticketing system. You've got new technology, you get it implemented, there's some change control. When problems come up, there's very focused individuals, but in the virtualization and the cloud space, we now need to have kind of a broader knowledge base than we had in just doing sysadmin. And then from the design space, we can still pull in specialists, but as the architect, overall architect, we need to understand all the pieces of input that we've gotten in that full design, which does make it a little bit more heavier lifting for us, but it also gives the ability to learn a lot more about a lot more different technologies and how the things integrate with each other.
Yeah, I think the interesting thing for me there is really putting the pieces together. So really first defining your logical design, so the requirements, the assumptions, the constraints, and all of that, and somehow thinking of something that could fit within that structure that you've initially blueprinted or
Yeah.
laid out. So
Yeah.
and yeah, I think your books are actually a great way to start, and I really recommend everyone to, if you haven't read them yet, to really look into them. And I believe the VCDX workshop also that you mentioned, I should say, from my point of view, very important was to get a mentor, either in
Yeah.
a big company. If you're in a big company or externally, you'll be surprised how many people are willing to help and to really give back. So I think this is really critical. Do you have any other tips, maybe how to, for someone that wants to grow into
I
to
think
this
I
role?
think the mentoring, doing the workshops are important. I think it's also good to actually identify others to work on a design that is allowed.
Mm,
Number two, because none of us can say that we're a deep dive expert in all of the areas, we
mhm,
have to rely on specialists in many cases.
yeah,
It's important to actually go through that review and getting others to work on the design so you can have a collaborative approach. You learn, you test with each other, you share information. So maybe I might pick a network deep dive person
Mm.
when I'm kind of a storage person, so that I don't miss out on the pieces that might need to go into the design. Here's the key reason why I say that. To maximize on your scoring in VCDX, when you do the panel defense, you need to touch on all those areas. AMPRS is what we listed
Mm.
out as the acronyms, but there are other areas that we call out in the blueprints. It's important to make sure that if you have to put fictional aspects in your design, it is allowed, but it poses higher risk. How do you eliminate that risk? Is making sure you understand the design criteria, making sure you put the business justifications or the business requirements in, and then the business justifications that supports that design area. So don't just put a piece of fictional information in the design to meet a checkbox. Make sure you understand how that would fit into the overall design. I think that's
Mhm.
important. There's one
Yeah.
other thing I'll give a tip for those who are going to VMware Explore in Barcelona next week, or any of the other events that are coming. I don't know the exact schedules, but there are VCDX activities at almost every event that we do. In the US, there was one where Corey Romero had done a special, meet the VCDX. They did a little mini boot camp, and it was for people that were aspiring to become a VCDX or wanted to learn more about the methodology. And as part of that, you will typically get to meet some of the executives. Not necessarily, I think, Raghu and Sumit right now, because we're going through the transition. So there's a lot of stuff that's on their plate. But some of the people that we've had in the past were senior VPs tied to networking, tied to cloud, the cloud BU, tied to storage. And it's a great opportunity to kind of hear from the business leads how they see the value of VCDX and what they're looking for from people who are doing architecture to help with better advances in what we're doing in our design.
Mhm. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's great. Yeah, and by the way, for anyone that's going to Barcelona, I'll be there. We have a booth with Runecast. We will have a lot of people, a lot of cool merchandise as well. So please come by and let's have a chat. And I didn't mention it first, but if you have any questions, either raise your hand or put it in the Q&A or in the chat. We're really happy to help. We're kind of jumping from one topic to another, but I think all of it is very relevant. I just want to maybe go back a little bit on the topic of AI, because one of the things we discussed previously is the future of AI assisted design, maybe. So how do you see it, or how do you imagine it?
So it's been kind of interesting, because there have been news articles that I've seen where people are posting, oh, AI is taking over the world. It's going to replace all the coders. It's going to replace all the doc writers. What the majority of people that I've talked to that are working with AI, in particular using large language models to help with coding, for example, or other types of design. I mean, this is an area that Chris McCain and I were talking about last week. Wouldn't it be great if we could use generative AI to say, hey, design me this infrastructure. Maybe it's a cloud or non-cloud infrastructure or whatever, and then use Gen AI to help develop basically a design doc, an implementation doc, a validation plan, and so on. That's possible, but I do see, as we go forward, there's going to be more collaborative approaches. Where, here's an example. In my sessions for VMware Explore, because I was talking about generative AI, large language models, and areas like that, once I completed my design, and I did this after I did my development of the presentation, I basically said, hey, this is what I'm using for an agenda. Here is some of the content for my presentation. Do you have recommendations? This is with ChatGPT 4. Do you have any recommendations for adjusting what you have? And it had confirmation on some of the areas, which was good. So I validated that. It had some suggestions for consideration. Some I chose to include, some I chose not to. But I also did find it did have some hallucinations, and some of them were kind of humorous. I don't remember the specific details. But in the session that Chris Gully and I did, this was the breakout session on AI. We had a little skit at the beginning where, I'm standing up at the stage. Chris is not there. and I'm looking at my watch and, got the presentation up and I go, well, it's really busy at the conference. And all of a sudden you can hear Chris Gully talking, well, where is this conference, room and all this? They've moved everything around. He comes in through the back door of the room. And the whole skit on this was the play on how, if we had Gen AI, this would be a benefit, to actually find things and solve some of these problems quickly. But, I have one of the Apple watches. People might have other smart watches. It's kind of like looking at your watch, tell me how to get here really quickly. There's another thing that that another friend of mine did, who actually found that, actually, this was actually Chris Gully in the presentation too. Sorry, same person. He actually went through to kind of call out some key points that he wanted to cover as part of our session. And he did the exact same thing that I did, and he learned a little bit more. So he tried to do the whole process of giving an example of large language models, and the whole entire process of manually doing the searching, doing the follow-up, doing the testing and confirmation took a lot of time. It was like maybe an hour or two, whether that's a lot or not, it's relative. But by using Gen AI, he could do the exact same thing in about 4 minutes. So if that gives you an idea, an hour down to 4 minutes, yes, there were some hallucinations. There was some information that may not have been relevant, but there was a lot of really good information that actually got all the same things that he did, but it was a huge shortcut. And that's where I see collaborative approaches with Gen AI and large language models will help.
Yeah, I see it the same way. And what really helps definitely is even when we're talking about designing something, designing an environment, and really taking into account all the business requirements and constraints and so on, is if you understand the process and also maybe have a bit of experience, that would really help you be more effective also with Gen AI, because you can validate if things there make sense, whether you need maybe additional prompts. Maybe you can realize that you haven't actually provided some aspects of the information that ChatGPT, for example, needs to know in order to come up with valid data. And you can also spot hallucinations much more easily. So So that doesn't cancel the fact that we have to learn and
I find it so funny that the term came up with hallucinations. It's well, I had to really validate that because I didn't believe it when I first heard it. But it's just kind of interesting. Some of these cloud, when it first came out, there were a lot of jokes about that. It's like, well, what is it? Is it anyway? It's kind of funny how these terms all of a sudden become set in stone, and that's the thing we use going forward.
I think this one will be used for years to come. So
yeah, exactly.
So yeah. Well, we're coming up to the top of the hour. Before we wrap it up, again, just to encourage the attendees, if you have any questions, please go ahead. This session is recorded, so you'll all get a link to the recording later on if you miss part of it. John, is there anything you want to say in closing before I wrap it up?
Yeah, what I do want to do is wish everyone the best in their future as they go, and whether they're pursuing the VCDX or want to learn more about it to help them with their sysadmin job or some of the work that they're already doing with architecture. I definitely want to encourage what the recommendations that we made on how to help you in that path. But I do want to wish you guys all the best. Thank you guys for joining. Hopefully I'll get to see you guys at VMware Explorer next year. I don't know if I think a lot of the individuals I see are probably outside the US. I don't recognize any names on there, but I'm sure we'll get a chance to meet at some point in the future. So definitely want to wish you all the best.
Thank you so much, John. Thank you. And it's always a pleasure speaking to you. I think we can do it for hours and new things will come up. So I really appreciate you taking the time, and I'm amazed we managed to wrap it in just 1 hour. So thanks again for joining. Thank you, everyone, and enjoy the rest of the day.